And it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening at this very important day for the University of Chicago, namely the inaugural lecture, the grand opening of the Neubauer Family Collegium for Culture and Society. Now, the Neubauer Collegium really grew out of the aspirations of the faculty of the University of Chicago, centered in the Humanities Division, the Social Science Division, for finding a way to transcend certain kinds of discourse. What they aspired to was a venue, a place, to be able to be engaged in looking at large-scale problems which were going to transcend the capacity of any one particular individual to be getting full clarity into it, to be transcending disciplines, to be transcending national borders, to be transcending, in fact, the boundaries of the standard places where humanistic and social science humanistic inquiry was applied. In other words, to be working in environments in which that type of discourse was going to be important and relevant, but where it was not going to be the only type of discourse that was important and relevant. So these conversations went on for some time and became a clearly articulated aspiration of the faculty. So that was the idea. But to turn idea into reality is something else. And we were fortunate to have the wonderful generosity of Jeanette and Joe Neubauer, not for the first time, to embrace this idea and to see the potential that it had for transformation. Joe and Jeanette have been extremely generous to the university in multiple ways, and what you see here in their embracing what is, in effect, a large departure to enable the university to do new things has been very typical of the way that they have thought about their philanthropy in general. So I want to express my personal and for the institution, as well as personal appreciation to Joe and Jeanette for everything that they're doing and enable us to realize these aspirations of our faculty. Now, there's one other thing one needs to realize aspirations, especially in a complicated environment. And I think from the description that I've given to you, you see that this is not an entirely simple thing to make happen. And what one needs is a leader. And we have the great benefit of a wonderful inaugural director for the Neubauer Family Collegium, and it's my pleasure to introduce him now, David Nierenberg.
I've brought a sermon. Thanks, President Zimmer, and welcome to you all. As you just heard, the Neubauer Collegium's establishment was animated by the conviction that many of the most challenging questions we want and need to ask about ourselves and our world require engagement with cultural and social forms of knowledge that the Europeans call the human sciences and we more clunkily call the humanities and humanistic social sciences. Our goal at the Neubauer Collegium is to catalyze that engagement. We have a threefold mission of supporting University of Chicago faculty in their collaborative pursuit of questions that transcend the ability of any one person or perhaps of any one discipline or method, of bringing researchers from around the world, including from around the Chicago centers we're building around the globe, to Chicago to participate in those collaborations, and of disseminating the results of those collaborations back into the world. While all of the Neubauer Collegium projects and programs have the humanities and the humanistic social sciences at their core, many of the difficult questions that our scholars are asking involve movement across academic disciplines and divisions, with collaborators from every art and science. So for example, in our 18 projects that we are supporting in this, our inaugural year, we have faculty not only from 17 departments in the humanities and social sciences, but also from nearly every other school of the University of Chicago. Musicologists are collaborating with physicists and anthropologists in Audio Cultures of India. English professors are collaborating with obstetricians working on narrative and public health in the Game Changer Chicago project. Film and media professors are working with statisticians and choreographers in cinemetrics. Classicists and archaeologists are working with economists in the working group on comparative economics. And that's just a few examples, 4 of the 18. And this year, too, we're welcoming a global array of visiting scholars from Spain, Switzerland, Syria, I'm stuck on the S's, China, India, Pakistan, France, Iraq. In fact, just this week, a multi-page story appeared in Al Jazeera about our program on Iraqi's intelligentsia. I could spend the entire evening telling you about what the Newbauer Collegium is doing, but that's not why you're here. And a much more inspiring way for me to give you a sense of what we aspire to is to introduce our lecturer tonight, William Kentridge. By introduce, I don't mean tell you about the many exhibitions he's received in storied museums across the world, nor about the operas he's directed in the major houses, nor about the honors and the prizes he's won. Although I would like to add one honor, one prize to the list you can read in your program, and that is one very close to home. In 2006, he received our own University of Chicago's Rosenberger Medal for outstanding achievement in the creative and performing arts. A proper introduction would give you a sense of Mr. Kentridge's work and of its importance. I can't do that. Mr. Kentridge is active across so many domains of culture. He's renowned for his drawings, films, statues, tapestries, mechanical theaters, and opera stagings, among other things. His interviews, conversations, and lectures themselves constitute an important body of philosophical inquiry on the nature of knowledge, perception, and experience. And in fact, right after tonight's lecture, if you like, you can go to the Seminary Co-op and buy his most recent book, hot off the presses, That Which Is Not Drawn, which is distributed by our own University of Chicago Press. His collaborations are legion with weavers and musicians, historians and anthropologists, playwrights, puppeteers, physicists, to name just a few. And the resulting works often transform how we feel and think about everything from the politics of the mining industry, the history of apartheid, or the artistic culture of the early Soviet Union, to our sense of time and space, the aging of our parents, even the nose on our own faces. William Kentridge has described his working process as just a hand slowly moving. In making his films, for example, he draws with thick charcoal on paper. He makes a drawing, shoots a frame, smudges, erases, redraws, shoots another frame, slowly building an animated film. And when I say slowly, I mean that if he draws, smudges, erases, redraws all day, he might achieve 10 seconds of film. These films and their underlying drawings have fascinated so many, not only because of their aesthetic beauty and interest, and not only because they are often vitally engaging, even urgent subject matter, but also because of the ways in which they provoke us into consciousness about our ways of seeing, thinking, feeling, knowing, and making our world. His art, if I can paraphrase the poet Auden, turns us all into intellectuals because it makes us more aware of the conditions of our own existence. I'd like to talk more about that working process and about the place of collaboration and movement across boundaries within it, but I'll leave that to tomorrow's event, a discussion with our dear colleague Jane Taylor on what William Kentridge calls the virtues of bastardy, that is, the virtues of working across genres, disciplines, and media. And I invite you all to join that conversation tomorrow, Regenstein Library, 5 to 6:30, room 122. So let me just conclude with just a word about what you're about to experience this evening. Franz Schubert composed Die Winterreise at the very end of his life in 1827. It was itself a collaboration of sorts, a setting to music of a cycle of poems by Wilhelm Mühle, which was called in the second edition, Poems from the Posthumous Papers of a Traveling Horn Player. In this interweaving of word and music, Schubert was assisted by his frequent collaborator, the baritone Johann Michael Vogel, as well as by his friends who gathered together regularly in what they called a Schubertiade, but we would call a collegium. The song cycle quickly became a focus of attention, not only musical, but also literary and philosophical, because of the ways, not least because of the ways, in which it dramatized how the human subject, in this case the singing subject wandering in a wintry landscape after leaving his love, projects meaning into the world as he moves through it. William Kentridge is at work on a film of Die Winterreise for the Vienna Festival, and it is this work he will present to us today. Together with Craig Terry and John Irvin from the Chicago Lyrics Ryan Opera Center, he will explore with us how artist and viewer, musician and hearer, creator and audience all collaborate in producing the meaningful interaction of sound and image. I hope, I trust, I know you can see why we're so thrilled that William Kentridge is here as our inaugural speaker. In his method, in his ambition, in his willingness to take risks, in his energy for collaboration, in the suggestiveness of his world-making and the sheer brilliance of his provocations to thought and discovery, he exemplifies much of what the Neubauer Collegium aspires to. His presence is exemplary of yet one more thing. It represents the Neubauer's important role in the intimate collaboration between philanthropy and culture that is so important in sustaining our arts and our sciences. On October 26th, the Neubauer Family Foundation will be underwriting the simulcast of Kentridge's production of Shostakovich's opera, The Nose, to thousands of theaters around the world. Who more fitting then to help us celebrate the opening of the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society? Please join me in thanking Joe and Jeanette Neubauer and in welcoming William Kentridge, who will help us to learn what it means to be listening to the image.
Thank you. The expectation of a lecture is that it will start with a few premises, go through a series of clearly reasoned arguments, and arrive at a clear conclusion at the end of the allocated time. And I hate to disappoint you from the beginning that is not the way we will be proceeding. I must also say how intimidating it is to be at the university and talking to an audience such as yourselves. When I arrived, I was asked if I was talking about sound and the image, that of course I was taking part in the debate between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And I needed to explain, no, that Schopenhauer and Nietzsche had been asked to wait in the antechamber, and that people wishing to engage with them could meet them after the lecture, but that we would not be going in that direction at all. The lecture works in reverse. It starts from work in the studio and then goes through a kind of reverse engineering to try to understand a possible interpretation of work that has been done, to try to find the thinking inherent in what the hand or the eye is doing in the studio. In this lecture or in this presentation, we go in two directions. We will start from work that exists in the studio and some reflections on what that could mean or what the origins of that could be. And then we will also go forward. Go forward in the sense that part of the thinking about the questions I'll be addressing today will be looked at in a very practical sense here on stage. Anton Chekhov wrote that if you see a gun on the stage in Act 1, you know in Act 3 it's going to be used. And here we have a very beautiful double-barreled Steinway. And we have two excellent, an exponent of the piano and an exponent of the voice, and they will be joining me in due course. But before we get to the Winterreise and before we get to the demonstration or the examination of some of the ways of thinking about sound and image, I want to go back several steps. There are two very different ways of approaching the world, which are simple and fundamental. The one is to think of a series of facts, to think of the world as a fact, a tree as a fact, like a photograph. Here it is, you understand it as a static thing. You can look at that for half an hour, it stays as it is. It is your time spent looking at that tree. The other way is to understand the world as a state, being in a state of provisionality. The world as existing in 25 frames per second. In which case you may look at a tree, but a tree is also understood not just as the tree, as the fact of the tree, but something, some moment in the transition between tree and timber and desk and book and pencil and flame and charcoal and smoke and ashes. And it has something to do with where we locate time in looking at the world. That is in some ways at the heart of the instability of sound and image that I want to talk about. So we have a static tree, and as I said, we can look at it for as long as we like, and we are aware that we are spending our time looking at the tree. But if we take that same image and we give it some hint of motion, a sense of something moving behind it, we're not looking at a single image, we're looking at the image 25 times every second, 25 frames a second. We become aware that it is not our time, that the time is somehow transferred into the image that we are watching. So there's a shift there. There's a way in which the image has to suffer the passage of time when it's in movement, whether it's static or whether it's moving itself, but the sense of the frames, the changing grain of the film, the flickering image transports us from it being entirely our own generosity to give the time to the film itself demanding it from it. There's a way in which our refreshing of the image 25 times a second, the persistence of vision of the image sitting on our eye for a 25th of a second and then being refreshed all of the time and sitting there, that we are involved very directly in that construction of the illusion of movement and the construction of the illusion of the passage of time in the image. And this sense of our both complicity and our separation from what it is to construct the time, I think is crucial in thinking about what does sound do to image, what is our connection to looking at a moving image or listening to a song and being involved with it or separated from it. So if we look at that same tree, now I did an exercise which was not slightly slower than it is here, it's slightly sped up here, which was going to sit in the garden to look at the tree which I was drawing and to try to make a list of the thoughts going through my head as I was spending time looking at the tree. So there was the sound of a hoopoe somewhere in the distance. There was thinking about the bark of the tree like someone's old skin. There was the distant sound of traffic like the ocean. There was the anticipation of rehearsals for the Nose in New York. There was a kind of unspecified anxiety that arose. There was looking at the ease of the tree's balance, an impulse to fix the structure of the tree, to draw the tree. I must make a swing for Emile, I thought. Syria, which I had not been thinking about till then. A memory of Ethiopian music. Two private thoughts, which are not to be described or repeated here. The branches of the tree like the brachy of a lung, peripheral vision, my shoes, the book I was writing in, images, thinking ahead to the lecture, to the piano in the lecture hall we would have here. The 53 years of the old age of the tree, the mortality of trees. I had to remember to buy whiskey the next day. A comparison, the companionship of the two ibises. A thought of anti-Zen. Anti-Zen. So those were the list of thoughts that were going through my head, and it's clear that already what we have here is an enormous separation between what one thinks one is doing when you're focusing, in this case, on the tree, and the fact that our mind is going in so many different ways. Particularly in this case because it was such a static image, and when we're sitting still and just watching the tree and allowing the thoughts to flow and go through us. And we have here also a contrast between the specificity of the image, the tree, the given, and the ambiguity of sound, the way in which a sound would come towards us and be expanded and think what it could associate to. There's a question of this unspecificity of sound and the very specificity of images that is key in trying to think of the relationship between music and sound when you're doing an opera, or in this case, thinking about a series of films for a series of songs. But to go to the first, back again to the beginning, I'll give you a list. Footsteps running, a door slams, a distant sound of a radio playing, a voice says, "Come in, sit down." There's a sound of paper, of machines, music from the radio. A crowd is shouting. There's a sound which is a train or paper moving in the street. So that list in itself is one way of hearing something and then having to translate it both into perhaps a visual set of images or a sound set of images, or most probably being very close to hearing. Here is a list being given from the stage to us. But I want to test the difference between listening to sounds like that
Это мое дело, хочу найти живую.
And then exactly the same set of sounds, but projected over a very neutral non-film.
Это мое дело, хочу найти живую.
So there I'm interested in the way in which, even though it's a non-film, there's no image, we're just looking at the pages turning in a book, there's something about the nature of the projected image which pulls that sound from being simply in our head or simply in the speakers and makes it hover somewhere between us and the screen, somewhere between where we are and what comes to us from the screen. And this for me becomes a very important point which we'll keep looking at further, the idea of the screen as a membrane, as an emblematic membrane of something halfway between the world and us. And it's very clear that in this example you have a very neutral set of pages of a dictionary turning in front of us. And the fact that we project onto that, or will onto that, some relationship of the sound to those pages, whether the paper turning quickly is what is making the pages turn. There's a desire which is almost irresistible to make a connection between the things we are hearing and seeing. And so we have to be aware very much of our activity, our agency in constructing that. Now, it's clear when we have sound in a film, there are three different ways in which the way in which that works. The first is the most obvious one of emotion. When there's a sad scene on the film, we have sad music, and we understand how that. We have exciting scene, we have a chase, we have fast music, and those map together in a very direct and obvious way. A second way has to do with the grammar of a film, in which the starting or the ending or the punctuation of the music or the soundtrack acts as a kind of punctuation in the narrative. It tells you what happens first, what causes something else. And there's a way certainly in helping us to read and construct a narrative or a set of order or logics in a film. But the third one is the one in some ways I'm most interested in. That has to do with the way in which the sound changes what we see, and what we see affects what we hear. So there are some times when there's an image which is so jerky that it seems unwatchable, but with the right kind of music it becomes smoothed out and changed. And this is the strange, unstable area where we think we have clarity and there is an objectivity. This film is going at a certain speed, but we cannot stop believing that its speed has changed and sped up or slowed down according to what we are hearing. This membrane that I'm talking about between the world and us is emblematic in a film, but it's also what happens in a drawing, when you have a set of marks on a sheet of paper, and both for the artist making it, but certainly for the viewer looking at it, there's a negotiation, there's an accommodation that happens between the world coming towards you on the sheet of paper, a rough drawing of an outline, and your projection, our projection onto that, saying, okay, these rough shapes make a horse, a rhinoceros. There's something in us that knows the shape of a horse, of a rhinoceros, that fills in, that accommodates, and even as the shape becomes less and less clear, we are still willing it into being as that shape. And that's our meeting of the world halfway, and it's what happens obviously and emblematically in the studio in the case of drawing, or here very obviously in the case of projection, where we know there is a projection onto a screen and that is coming back to us and we are receiving it. But the larger point is, I think that although this is the obvious activity of the studio, it is a fundamental way that we always operate in the world. That whenever we think we have an understanding of something, it is always a mixture between what comes towards us and what we project onto it to construct a meaning. And it's this sense of constructing what comes towards us is the heart of what I'm interested in thinking about. What are the images we construct around a sound, and what is the sound that makes sense of certain images? Let's take another example. Again, this is a found piece of sound and a found set of images. The images are simply the turning pages of a 1907 Larousse encyclopedia, and the sound is a recording of a political meeting in a fish shop in Marseille in 1932. It's about 20 seconds long.
Alors, mesdames, vous savez que c'est aujourd'hui que nous faisons la réunion politique à la poissonnerie. La parole, qu'est-ce qui veut la parole? À moi, à moi, à moi, je demande la parole. Prends-le sur une trompe de certitude. Merci. La parole est à la citoyenne Pébon. Citoyenne. Comme poissonnière, j'ai pas l'habitude de parler politique, mais puisque nous sommes réunis ici, je veux lâcher ma pétade comme les autres. Silence! Citoyenne, nous se plaignons que les affaires ne vont pas, c'est parce que nous payons trop d'impôts. Ça vient que nous sommes bouffés par les factionnaires, les fonctionnaires d'impotés, les factionnaires. C'est un tas de galavards qui nous prennent notre argent et qui servent de rien. Je l'ai la preuve, le sous-préfet. Je ne veux pas dire qu'il ne fasse pas plaisir lorsqu'il s'en va avec ton beau chapeau à cornes et ses brailles neuves dans les coulisses de la bricole pour donner des médailles de chocolat, des récompenses, mais qu'est-ce que nous fichons de cette escaillevage?
So, again, there's something about us that can't stop believing that somehow those words and that spittle is calling the images out of the pages as they go. Even in this sense where there's a random mapping of them on. There's no attempt to edit the pages to find the emphases, the moments of emphases. It's saying there's enough of a fluidity in the synchronicity and in our reading of it and our construction of it to pull those gaps and pieces together. And this is obviously an important consideration in thinking, how does one work with images that relate to this very specific song cycle of the Winterreise. And there's one last example which I'd like to show before we get to the central section of the lecture. Another example of trying to test out, in this case, a constructed piece of sound, not a found piece of sound, and a constructed set of images, but again with the interaction between them fairly loose. It's also about 1 minute long.
The Invention of Africa, Berlin, 1938. Nyasaland, 1915. Picasso on safari, Paris. Africa has been invented 6 times. The seventh invention of universal teaching does not please, our blood does not deserve to be a man. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. To flesh it out, government even at that Africa was invented by the rich hats on the streets of the city, reading newspapers, early stages of farm growth, but landlords that never get shops, never eat from the never people from outside the it was difficult waiting for winter pairs of African want and this constructing his existentialist history of the story. End of story. End of story. End of story.
So those are different examples of ways of trying to see what are the edges of working between sound and image. How far can it stretch from the logic? How far can one take meaning away from it? The set of almost random images going together with the exploded text of thinking about Africa, or the voice of the politician, or the sounds of the bird calls in the garden. And at this point, to take this one stage further, I suppose I should ask for volunteers in the audience, if there's anyone who can play the piano and who can sing, but more specifically, anybody who can play Dizzy Fingers by Zez Country, the great Illinois composer, or can sing Kernan Hammerstein's The Song Is You. So if I could ask Craig Terry and John Irvin from Ryan Opera to join me on stage. Here we get into the dangerous part of the lecture, in that a lot of it is, we met yesterday and we said, well, let's try a few of these different songs and a few different sets of images, but it's very much a testing out of things, so that the editing is wrong, the sync is wrong, the timing will be wrong, but this is very much the way it works in the studio, trying to find out the grammar of sound and image. We'll do this in 2 ways. We're going to look at sometimes the same images with very different music, and then later on the same music with different sets of sound. The way the longer project of Winterreise proceeds, there's still a year before, or 9 months before that is produced, and I'm at the stage of trying to see what are the limits of the project. And this very kind invitation to come and use you as guinea pigs and join